Good afternoon, everybody. I'm actually standing here today because we're about to do a rehearsal for an open day. We have a whole series of open days this week, and we've just come into the NYP one. But I also want to talk to you about something that happened this morning. This morning we had a Remembrance and Service Day assembly, and it was a perfect moment to illustrate what really good intercultural learning looks like. Because it was so unlike a normal service. We had poems for a start from around the world, from Japan, from Sweden, from Portugal, from Spain as some examples. And that meant there was a real reflection on what this means to people around the world, not in a single country. And it had so much poignancy because of that. And it was a great reminder of why interculturalism is so important to our school. And as an illustration of the demand for our expertise on interculturalism, we're going to show you a section from something I've had to do this week. This week I've had to do a talk for students in Hong Kong, and they have come to us because they know that we are a school that models interculturalism. So enjoy. As well as being the head of school, I'm also a CIS visitor, that's Council of International Schools, and they go and accredit international schools, which means they work very, very closely with the IB. And their approach is very similar to the IB, and lots of IB schools are also accredited by the Council of International Schools. One of the things that they want to see is that every single school has its own contextual approach to global citizenship with an idea of intercultural learning and also potentially international learning. Now the problem I have when I go to lots of schools, and I've seen it, is lots of schools just don't understand what that means. If you say to a school, please can you have your own definition of intercultural learning, they'll look at you as if completely bemused. And lots of schools will say, well, we do the IB, so isn't it that? And it isn't that. CIS doesn't think it should be that, nor does the IB. They think that you should explore further. The book called The Culture Map is a really good way of thinking about how to explore it further. And what that book shows is that when different cultures meet, there are actually a whole series of levels that you need to explore for different cultures to understand each other. And that's true in a school, and it actually has an effect on the school, and I'm going to talk about some of those. So basically what the book does, it looks at lots of different areas where there are cultural clashes, if you like, and looks at how they come about. So for example, talks about the nature of communication in different cultures, and it splits it in what you might call high context and low context. Low context cultures are ones where people say exactly what they mean, and there's no nuance, there's no expectation that you read into body language. Culture just say what they mean, and that's exactly what you would expect. So for example, the Netherlands is seen as very high on that, and if you're in the UK, there's actually a dictionary called the Dutch English Dictionary, where the Dutch have written out things that the British say, what you think they mean and what they actually mean. And there are lots of countries like that where people say what they mean. At the other end is a list of cultures where there's actually a lot of nuance and there's a lot of context. So even though somebody says something, to understand it, you have to understand the whole context behind what's said. And those cultures need to communicate. And they can only really communicate if they understand why somebody on one hand has a high context culture. So Japanese, for example, is seen as a high context culture. On the other hand, you've got a low context culture like Holland, where people just say exactly what they think and don't understand nuance, don't understand why things are suggested through other means rather than just what's said. That's one example. Second example, which has a big effect on school, is something called is our approach to evaluating. Now, there are some cultures that have something called direct negative feedback and others that have indirect negative feedback. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to a French school, you will basically be told most of the time that what you do is what's wrong with what you do in a classroom. So you'll say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And occasionally you'll be told something's right. So the good things are said really, Most of the time you're told that this is wrong and you need to do this. In other cultures, it's exactly the opposite. People are told they're really good at that, this is what you're strong at, and even if you've done something wrong, you start by telling people how good they are, and the things you need to improve on are couched. They're shown, they're not made completely obvious. So lots of cultures will start saying, yeah, that's really good, but actually underneath there's something that you need to do and you need to listen for it. Now again, when those situations clash, it's quite difficult because somebody will expect to be told lots of negative things and then be surprised at a positive, and somebody else will be expecting lots of positive things with the negatives sort of implied. They have to work together. There's also decision making. Some cultures are more hierarchical than others. Some have a more collaborative way of coming to decisions. Again, those cultures need to work together. And intercultural learning, and even in the IB sense, means understanding these different facets of different cultures and seeing how different cultures and schools can work together. Here, having so many cultures in our school, including the staff, we have to think about that all the time. Recognise why people behave in different ways and look at ways to help and to support, but more than anything, to make sure that one person will understand somebody else, not see it as rude, but understand it's simply a different way, and it's the same for students. I have one really good story about that which reflects something that I once saw in Hong Kong. When I was in Hong Kong, I went to a staff meeting, and in that staff meeting, a lot of Western teachers, sort of British, Australian, were talking about how difficult it was in a Chinese classroom because students weren't speaking and they didn't know how to get them to speak in groups. And at one point, a Chinese teacher put up their hand and said, I'm really fed up in hearing people saying that Chinese students don't talk. We're taught to say something when we've really got something important to say, whereas you lot just talk on and on and on, whether you've got something important to say or not. And actually that's something very similar is talked about in the culture map. But again, that's a sign of a classroom and some of the problems of intercultural learning. You can't go into a classroom with your cultural expectations and think you can simply impose it on another group of students who think in a different way. What you need to do is understand those students, and they need to understand you, and then you need to reach an agreement on the way you proceed. I also think that means that there needs to be a lot of work done on collaborating in different contexts and understanding how different people think and work. I've got an understanding how complicated it is. I have a picture on the right, top right, of a woman called Untitled Chapter, who was fed up of being asked where she came from because she's lived in America, one of her parents is Ghanaian, another one has lived in Saudi Arabia, so she never knows how to answer that. She started saying sometimes she's American, sometimes she's Ghanaian, sometimes she's also got some other nationalities she refers to. But she stopped saying that now. Now she says she's multi-local. And she thinks, I don't really identify with all these countries. I identify with traditions I've lived with in different cities around the world. And actually, they're much more connected than anything I have to do with a country. And she has a much more complex identity than simply thinking about yourself as being part of one country. People begin more and more to identify with place and see themselves as more complex. People are more multilingual now. The person on the bottom he did a TED talk, I can't remember his name now, but he also talks about his identity being very, very complicated. So he may look Indian, but for him, growing up, Spider-Man had as much influence as anything to do with his specific culture. And that's how the world is now. It's interconnected, complicated. We have all sorts of different global influences coming at us. We live in different places. Our relationship to languages is growing and changing, and we need to find ways to deal with that, and that's also what schools need to do. I hope you enjoyed the video and got a sense of why interculturalism really does matter in the educational world.